there is a tradition in Canada that housing is delegated to the municipalities. But the concern is that if there is undersupply of housing, systemic undersupply of housing that leads to excessive house price growth, excessive debt growth, and Canada's huge levels of household debt, then if things go bad, we're all in it together. And that suggests that the federal government needs to be involved as well.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Inside Policy Talks, where we discuss today's most pressing policy issues shaping Canada. Housing is a significant component of economic stability and an area of great importance for all Canadians. And recently, as I think everybody knows, the Canadian housing market has been under increasing strain. Skyrocketing rents, soaring home prices, combined with shortages in construction, leaving many Canadians feeling like affordable, secure housing is just out of reach. To help us make sense of these issues, I'm thrilled to welcome Deputy Chief Economist with CMHC, Iorweth, a leading voice in housing policy and economics, to the podcast today. In this episode, we'll discuss how the rental market is adapting or failing to adapt to record high immigration levels and shifting population trends. We'll discuss how taxation policies and rising mortgage rates are reshaping the affordability picture for homeowners and renters. We'll discuss the critical roles of municipal regulations, zoning laws, and construction in either enabling or hindering progress. And lastly, we'll touch on the role of government at every level in addressing or exacerbating Canada's housing challenges. So hi, Alan. Welcome to Inside Policy Talks. We're really glad to have you here today.
Thank you.
So let's kick off. So Alan, maybe you can just give us your impressions of how the housing market has evolved, particularly since the pandemic. And where do you see the market going in the near term?
Well, there's been a lot of changes in the housing market, as you say, particularly since the pandemic. There were some long-standing trends there towards a loss of affordability, but the pandemic seems to have lit the fuse into the housing market. People started moving from the city centres to the outer areas. They were searching for more space. There's been a little bit more mobility away from the high-priced city centres of Toronto and Vancouver. We've seen prices go up in Halifax, for example. So there's been a outward movement of all of these price trends that were there. And this has led to affordability being a major concern for almost everybody in Canada. It's fair to say that maybe it's a little bit less of a problem in Alberta, but I think even now that they're starting to feel the impact of population growth on Alberta, and prices are starting to go up there. So all in all, it's prices have gone up. There's an affordability problem across the board. The high interest rates have muted that to a certain extent, although there's a part of that we're a bit concerned about long term, and that high interest rates have also curtailed housing supply. And we can dig into that, how that happens later. But all of this is making us quite concerned about the housing system, housing affordability, and the need for more housing supply. It's a comprehensive problem, and the other challenge, obviously, is the time dimension. So building physical houses, it's a 1 to 2 year process depending on the structure. The regulatory process then is a multi-year process, and so all of this means that increasing housing supply, it takes years. There is no rapid response, and frankly, we need to be at it all the time.
Indeed. Of course, there's nothing new about high housing prices in Canada. If you look at residential prices, they've shown a long-term upward trend with certainly some volatility post-pandemic. What are some of the main drivers of this long-term trend increase in housing prices? And what's the interaction with broader economic conditions?
I think certainly if you look back at the data, house prices started to disconnect probably a couple of decades ago. and it's a little bit different with affordability, where you're comparing house prices with income, but certainly house prices, they're probably been going up for a couple of decades. And the broad reasons for that are general economic growth, population growth. There was a period there of fairly low interest rates. All of this was stimulating demand. But then what we're seeing on the supply side, we're economists, so we look at demand and supply, and yes, demand was going up, but the supply responsiveness was a bit weak, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver. Given the magnitude of the demand increases, the price increases, supply should have responded more, and it didn't do that for a whole variety of reasons. So demand goes up, supply hasn't caught up, prices go up.
Good. Maybe we can dig into the demand side a little bit before we turn to the supply side. Certainly, we've seen very significant increase in population growth over the last few years. The current government increased both permanent immigration and temporary immigration, although they've very recently decided to dial that back a bit. How important is population growth writ large and immigration in particular in driving demand for housing in Canada, and then presumably also prices?
It's critical. So it's not the only factor. Like I said, incomes are a factor as well. But clearly, I mean, it's a bit of a tautology, but all households need to be housed. And if you increase housing demand, if you increase immigration, they need to be housed somewhere, and it's an automatic increase in demand. And what I think has been also a little bit difficult is predicting what that increase will be. I think more effort should have been done on scenario analysis on what might happen if there were an increase in immigration, because, as I said, the system is quite slow to respond to higher population growth. There are probably two particular challenges with immigration. One is that when people come into Canada, they do tend to go to Toronto and Vancouver, which are already facing affordability challenges, and as I said, already had housing supply challenges. And so, if you add additional demand, there's a concern there. The second point is that it's a bit of a generalization, but when immigrants arrive in Canada, they generally tend to go into the rental system first. Some obviously come in with a lot of income and go straight into home ownership. But given a lot of immigrants need to get a mortgage, and so they don't have the credit status to apply immediately for a mortgage, they usually go into the rental system. And the rental system in Canada is facing a lot of stress. Vacancy rates are extremely low, 1% to 2% in Southern Ontario and in the Lower Mainland. Rents, if you can find a place, are increasing rapidly. And so the inflow of immigration did put a lot of stress on the rental system. Now, obviously, we have to say that immigrants contribute to the Canadian economy in the long term. But the flow did introduce challenges to the housing system.
Do you think the recent changes in federal immigration policies are going to have a significant impact on the housing market in the near term? And I'm thinking in particular about international students and the cap on international students, and whether that's going to affect some of these particular rental markets that have been under strain.
I think there's a lot of devil in the detail and understanding of how temporary residents, whether they become permanent residents, whether they find alternative mechanisms to remain in Canada. So I think there's a lot of detailed understanding of the immigration system that needs to take place. And so others have indicated some skepticism about whether the population growth will actually decline materially. So I think there's considerable uncertainty. Now, obviously, if the policies are effective and we get lower population growth, this will lower the upward pressure on house prices, but and rents. But obviously, it's everything is relatively slow moving. The, there's also a slight risk that developers, builders will look and say, well, immigration growth in future will be lower. So in future, there will be less demand for housing. And so maybe we should hold off on building that new rental building. And so it's a bit two-edged there that, yes, it could lower immigration could lower demand growth, but might increase uncertainty on the supply side as well. So it's a tough call to make in practice.
Sticking with the demand side for a bit, I want to talk a little bit about interest rates. A lot of speculation the Bank of Canada is going to make a move at the time that we record this. How much do interest rates, movements in interest rates, at least the bank rate, affect housing demand in the near term? And how much should policymakers be worried either by raising interest rates so they can really reduce affordability and bring prices perhaps crashing down, or if they go too much in the other direction, they'll just risk reigniting a boom in housing prices?
Well, I think it's clear that interest rates have a major impact on the demand side. And so it's a little bit, but it has a tendency of being a short-term effect. So I think the affordability problem that Canada faces is a long-term structural issue lasting decades. And fluctuations in interest rates, they do affect the ease of getting a mortgage, shall we say, in the short term. And so it has these impacts on changing demand for housing. But by the same token, if the bank were to lower interest rates significantly, it doesn't really affect the long-term structural challenge of affordability in Canada. And indeed, as you said, low interest rates, there is a risk there that they stimulate demand for housing again. So, and this was a little bit what happened in 2005, 2006 in the US, where the housing demand, it went too far and led to a bubble at that time. So I think the Bank of Canada has to be very prudent with interest rates. Yes, it influences short-term affordability, but the affordability challenge that Canada faces will only really be affected by increasing housing supply over the long term.
Indeed. So let's turn to the supply side and want to dig into some of the reasons that we just don't seem to be able to build the number of homes that we think that we need to have. I wanted to start off with digging a little bit into productivity. The residential construction sector in Canada is, I think, notorious, and Canada is not the only country in which this is true, but the fact that productivity has just been there's essentially been no growth. If there's been any growth, it's probably been very, very slightly negative, not just in recent years, but for decades. We see other parts of the economy where productivity will climb, but residential construction, it just seems that we seem to be building houses the same way we built them 30 years ago. So I'd be curious in your thoughts as to what are some of the factors that's keeping productivity or stopping productivity growth in residential construction. And I'd be interested in your thoughts as well about some techniques that hold out some promise for increasing productivity, in particular modular construction that you hear a lot about. And I think in countries like Sweden, for instance, the home of IKEA, perhaps not a coincidence there, and they've been using this with some success.
Yeah, the promise of productivity is great, but it's been a while like that. So to open with your or to start with your opening question, yes, productivity growth in construction in Canada, arguably in Canada overall, has been very weak. In construction in particular, I would say productivity has been very weak in the US as well. There was a recent very highly cited paper in the US, and the title was something along the lines of the pathetic growth of productivity in US construction. So clearly the industry has a challenge. Why that is the case, I'm not sure that anybody has dug too much into detail on it. There's evidence of low productivity. The extent of digitization seems quite low. I made the joke the other day, perhaps inappropriately, that the last major innovation in construction was the building of the Empire State Building, which led to a change in apartment construction. Um, so clearly, there is a problem there. We're also hearing that the labor force in construction is quite old, and there's an imminent wave of retirements in the industry, and so there's a lot of concerns about productivity. Why that is the case? Part of it is potentially government regulations. The It takes a lot of money to go through the development process in Canada. The regulatory burden is quite heavy, and that suggests that some of the development companies need to be very large in order to go through that process. And so the government regulation may lead to a more oligopolistic development industry. So we have to be a little bit careful about causality here. Um, but the flip side of that is that if we split or we separate the development industry from the construction industry, it seems that the construction side is extremely fragmented, broken up, lots of small companies, lots of mom and pop companies. There are some interprovincial regulations on flows of skilled workers. Credential recognition is an issue. So there's a lot of the construction side is highly fragmented, and in that sort of world, there's an underinvestment in technology, in machinery. Coordinating in order to have standardization is very difficult. And that gets me to when you raised modular housing. It seems that there's a lot of potential there of mass producing parts of housing and then getting those onto site and building relatively quickly. Now, that does rely on a lot of other factors, so that a lot of builders, for example, agree to the same specification in order to exploit economies of scale. It relies on multiple municipalities allowing those parts to be standardized. It even calls on the architects when they're designing buildings to realize that they need to standardize parts or standardized looks. I've heard, for example, that the architects of social and affordable housing will put these special features in, and it just destroys the whole potential for economies of scale. So when you have when you have a fragmented industry, no incentives really to invest. Everybody's making a lot of money. The whole design regulatory system doesn't seek those cost benefits. So the potential is there, but you could see the challenges in actually getting it to materialize. Now, hopefully, the industry is starting to realize this. Some of the recent modular construction in Canada has benefited from importing from Eastern Europe, from, as you said, Sweden, Lithuania, Poland, and so forth. And hopefully, this is a bit of a shock to the Canadian development and construction ecosystem to invest and develop more standardization, economies of scale, and really try and lower cost.
Interesting. Let's maybe zoom in on municipal zoning, building regulations, then in maybe even more detail. I mean, how critical are they to the housing supply shortage, and are there some reforms that could improve the situation?
My view is that these are central issues, and the whole regulatory system, development fees, and so forth. And these fall within the purview of the municipalities. Now, that's not to say that the municipalities can solve these on their own, but they are a crucial issue. there are now extensive federal supports for, say, rental construction, but these are affecting the financing of construction. That they don't affect, shall we say, the pre-approval stage of construction. Once you get approval, there are government funds now to support development and construction. The challenge is the pre-approval stage. Um, to give some sense of magnitude, what we are hearing, there's no official data on this, I should say. What we're hearing is that getting approval in Toronto, Vancouver is a 3 or 5 year process. Getting approval in Alberta is sort of a 2 year or less process in Edmonton, Calgary. So these are very lengthy approval. They're very highly complex with multiple dimensions. And now we're seeing development fees go up as well on top of that regulatory burden. So last year, there was a joint study of CMHC and Statistics Canada on the regulatory burden in Canada across the individual cities. And it found, oddly enough, that the burden of regulation is very highly correlated with the lack of affordability. So this is the international evidence as well. There's been long-standing studies in the U.S. that there is that the regulatory burden at the local level is a challenge to housing supply. Now, some of that regulation may be well intended, but the manner in which it is implemented creates lots of challenges.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to dig into development fees in a minute, but you mentioned other countries. I'd be curious to get a sense of, particularly in the US, of course, I mean, we can't help but compare ourselves to the US. Are there parts of the US where they're able to get through this approval process much more quickly? And other parts of the US where it's like us, or other parts of the US that it's even worse than us?
Yeah, I would generally split the US a little bit similar to Canada into two parts. So the first, where there is quite a strong regulatory burden, are the coastal areas, New York, Boston, San Francisco, California, LA. The regulatory burden is high. There are affordability challenges there. And what we see is generally low population growth in those areas. So even though there are centers of innovation, of technology, the population in these areas is not as great as in other areas. And some have argued that housing affordability has a major impact on that. I mean, it's all very nice to get a job in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, but the housing costs are enormous. On the flip side to that, you see places like Atlanta, Houston, they're affordable. People are moving there. Arguably, part of it is the climate, but housing is affordable. You see, yes, strong economic growth there. You see strong population growth, and you don't see high house prices. That's not to say they're a panacea. These are cities that spread horizontally, which may have some consequences. Environmental infrastructure, getting around Atlanta is quite a challenge, but housing is affordable, and so it's quite a dichotomy within the U.S. and a little bit analogous to Canada, where affordability is relatively greater in Alberta and a problem in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and so forth.
Yeah, cool. Let's dig into development fees. I think there's been a fair amount of talk recently about these increasing quite significantly. And maybe for our listeners, just maybe talk about what development fees are supposed to be for, perhaps, or at least, in economic principle, what they should be for. And is the money actually being used just for that, or is it being used for other purposes?
Right, and that last bit is the key question. And I'm not sure. The initial economic approach on this was that development fees were intended to pay for very local infrastructure that would tie to the development of new housing. So if you had a new house, that house would put a burden on local water infrastructure, schools, whatever. And so the idea was that there would be a fee to compensate for building that new infrastructure. So new house tax to pay for infrastructure to support it. That's one argument. And so that leads to the idea that growth pays for growth. There is the counter argument to that is that, well, if growth pays for growth, then you get less growth. And that's why Quebec had traditionally gone in a different direction, where a lot of that local infrastructure was paid for by the province. At the time, Quebec felt it had a strategic interest in growing the population of Quebec. And if the province wanted to grow the population, then the province needed to support housing. And so the province paid for local infrastructure. That did lead to higher income taxes, sales taxes, but it did lead to lower development fees or non-existent development fees and lower taxes on new housing. And so it's one of the arguments why housing used to be a lot more affordable in Quebec. It was because there was very limited taxes and fees on new construction. So there are those different models. Ontario, British Columbia have gone more for the development fee approach. And the concern recently has been that those development fees have been going through the roof. And it's not entirely clear why. Yes, some costs did go up during the pandemic. There were supply chain issues, but in general, those have been resolved. But we're seeing increases in development fees over the last year, 20, 30% or whatever. And these are now very sizable fees. So we're looking at in excess of $100,000 and more in places like Toronto. So can those fees be justified? Can the increase in fees be justified? That's a little bit difficult to say. I think it would certainly be helpful if there were a lot more transparent reporting on what is happening to these revenues, if there was proper accounting for them. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but there are issues of financial versus accrual accounting. But so given the impact that these fees are having on new home construction, I think it's reasonable to expect or to hope that there would be very transparent reporting on what is happening to the revenues of those fees. Because, as I said, they're compounding a already difficult regulatory structure.
I think that makes sense. And if the justification for these kinds of fees is the cost of sewer hookups and things like that, that really shouldn't vary so much from one municipality to another, one wouldn't think.
Right, there probably should be exploration of different models of paying for water infrastructure, electricity, and so forth. So, can those be organized differently? Perhaps still being owned by the province, but maybe having more user fees on water or some way of financing infrastructure that does not put the burden on new home buyers.
Right. I'd like to switch to taxation side, as we think of policy instruments, and this is one that governments up to the federal level, the federal and provincial level, have to hand. I'd like to start with the measures like the Underused Housing Tax Act and duplicate taxes. I mean, they've been criticized by some people as ineffective or even harmful. What do you think the impact of these has been on the housing market?
Well, there's a long history of these sorts of taxes, even going back to the banner taxes on foreign buyers of maybe 8 years, 2018, something like 2017, 2018. These sorts of taxes have some sort of immediate impact on the housing system, but they don't seem to fundamentally change the long-term trajectory of the housing system. Now, you could argue that these taxes make the housing system more legitimate in the views of Canadians, that Canadians will say, well, given all of these taxes, then the housing system is working for me. getting money laundering out, getting foreign buyers out, getting large investors out, and it sort of leaves you to, okay, then it's housing is intended for housing Canadians or people resident here. So I suppose there is an argument there. But the counter argument is that they don't seem to be having a long-term impact on affordability. Secondly, there is a concern that they're introducing risk or uncertainty into the decisions of those building housing. So there have been limitations proposed on short-term rentals, for example. But we know from what is currently happening in Toronto that the investors are really deserted condominium construction in Toronto. So getting investors into new home construction is extremely important. And so if there is a policy environment that makes that decision more risky, it's probably not the way to go.
Yeah, interesting. Are there other things on the tax side that could help with affordability, in your opinion?
Well, I have to admit, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about these because I think the chances of some of them getting implemented are really quite remote. I think there is scope for changing some of the systems. So, for example, but they are quite controversial. So, for example, you may want to think about having higher property taxes on larger or more expensive homes. There is a rationale there, and the design of property taxes really does differ quite a lot across Canada. It may be that we should use the tax system to discourage more building far out from the city. So I don't mean rural communities, but to discourage large developments which entail long commute times. So I think, for example, in Phoenix in the US, they use property taxes or development fees to discourage people from going too far into the desert and putting stress on the water system. So there are potentially good uses, but I don't really think that they can be implemented to reduce demand for housing in the long term. It's just now on the flip side, I think there's probably scope for more fiscal support for low-income households or for building more housing. Clearly, middle-class Canadians are suffering from housing affordability challenges, but there are people with low incomes that are really suffering and finding it difficult to find a place to live. And in those cases, having more direct subsidy for housing may be the way to go if there is enough housing being built. So there is scope out there, but the implementing them and making sure that they're being positioned within the broader context of the housing system is quite a challenge. I had the phrase recently that there is no silver bullet. There may be a silver buckshot, but there is no silver bullet in this area.
I'd like to talk a little bit about land, and of course, if you're going to build housing, you need land. And I think maybe one or two cities in the US have looked at taxing unused land. How much developable land is there in Canada? Like, folks, I know, of course, a lot of land in Canada, the world's second biggest country, but it is around these major urban centers. Are people sitting on tracts of land that are relatively developable and are not coming into the market for some reason, or is it just a real, unless we go into the green belts, there just isn't really a lot of land out there, especially if you're looking to build single-family homes?
The data on land is really quite poor, I would say, particularly on the ownership side. The data on ownership in Canada is really almost non-existent. But I have to admit that my suspicion is that there is quite a lot of land out there, but it is zoned significantly differently. You travel around Toronto, Vancouver, um, the way in from the airport. There's a lot of low density industrial areas that are located fairly close to downtown. Those areas are then zoned for industrial use, for employment zones, and you can't mix employment or industrial zones with housing for historical reasons. So, one of the reasons zoning was initially invented or designed was to prevent housing being close to the smokestacks, and so there was a separation there, which may have had a rationale in the 19th century. But the challenge now is that the zoning is for employment, and getting changing that designation into housing is quite difficult. There was the whole challenge of what Google tried to do in Toronto, close to the lake. So, and you travel in that area, it looks pretty industrial, and it looks like prime housing land. So I think there are a lot of things caught up in the zoning. That there are a lot of post-industrial zones that surely need to be developed. So if it were made a lot easier to rezone those areas, you could probably get a lot of housing built. Um, the green belts, there are arguments pros and against. It certainly seems that Canadians do value their single detached housing and are a bit reluctant to go into apartments for whatever reason. It may be, however, that we're at such a crisis point that people will be happy to go into at least something they own. It's just condominiums. So the green belts, there are environmental consequences. There are consequences for infrastructure. The instinct is that there's a lot of land within cities that could be redeveloped, but redeveloping them is really difficult. And this ties into the large areas of Toronto in particular, and Vancouver as well, that are zoned for single detached housing. Now, I know the government has increased that recently. I think it's to 4 units. But the challenge is that we need serious density. We need high rises, 20, 30, 40 stories. Moving to 1 to 4, I'm not sure that it's going to be sufficient given the scale of the affordability challenges. So there must be scope for rezoning vast areas of these cities.
As we move to a close here, just a couple more questions for you, Alad. First, maybe talk a little bit about the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is an initiative that this government put forward. Maybe explain to viewers what that is, and then just maybe talk a little bit about whether we've seen any early signs of success from it.
Well, the idea of the Housing Accelerator Fund originally was that there are a lot of these regulatory burdens at the local level. Now, as I said previously, municipalities are responsible for these regulations, but they exist because there's a lot of pressure on municipalities to address various concerns. A lot of local citizens are concerned about the burden of additional housing, on roads, on education, and so forth. And so there's always this pressure on municipalities to oppose new housing construction. And so the idea was to say, okay, this is a fair concern. And so what the federal government needs to do is to come in and say, well, we will give you an incentive on the other side. So if you build more housing, we will transfer resources to you so that you can cope better with that greater infrastructure demand, with the burden of more congestion and so forth. And so the idea was to really provide an incentive, positive incentive for local governments to encourage more housing supply. It was roughly modeled on the new homes bonus in England. England, for many years, decades, has faced housing affordability challenges, and they had done the work and realized that housing supply is a critical problem in England. And so this was one of the approaches that the government in London was using to encourage more local housing supply, was to, as I said, try and balance out these incentives on housing and make local governments realize that there were indeed benefits to allowing more construction. Implementation of it has gone ahead. The idea was first, I think, introduced in Canada in 2018. Implementation has been going in the last couple of years. I think it is encouraging change by the municipalities. Obviously, things take time, but there is change there. We've seen that there's also incentive for change coming from the provincial governments, particularly in BC and Ontario. So the rhetoric has changed, I think, towards more housing supply. The Housing Accelerator Fund is part of encouraging, incentivizing that change. Perhaps it could have been a little bit less adversarial and perhaps a little bit more mechanical. So there are reforms potentially there that could make it more effective. But I think the overall initial impetus was a positive one to try and encourage more housing supply and give local government incentives to change.
Great. Maybe just a last question, Alan, as we wrap up here. We think about the different levels of government. Whose job is this? I mean, is this whose primary responsibility should this be? And who needs to really step up the plate? I mean, the federal government has been doing a lot of things in this area. The provincial governments, I think, at least some of them are quite active here as well. Who's on first here, and are people working together the way they need to really deal with this really pressing challenge?
I think this is a very challenging question, and not just at the political level. There's a lot of confusion within the bureaucracy, the public service, and who is responsible for what. So I think there are multiple challenges here. I think what we have to first keep in mind is that housing affordability is a problem for all Canadians. It should not, I don't see that it necessarily has to have a lot of left versus right challenges. There are different in emphasis of social housing versus market housing, but we're now facing an affordability crisis across the board. It's pervasive. And so my hope is that everybody in government needs to, and in all orders of government, need to work together on this. There is a tradition in Canada that housing is delegated to the municipalities, but the concern is that if there is undersupply of housing, systemic undersupply of housing, that leads to excessive house price growth, excessive debt growth, and Canada's huge levels of household debt, then if things go bad, we're all in it together. And that suggests that the federal government needs to be involved as well. So as we saw in 2008 in the US, when there is a housing crisis, it's the federal government that needs to be involved. So I think it should be recognized as being much more of a shared responsibility, and everybody needs to be pulling in the same direction.
Great. Okay, well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground on the pressing issues in Canada's housing market, from the growing gap between population growth and housing supply, the challenges posed by rising rents, taxation policies, and municipal regulations. So I'm going to thank you, Alan. Your insights have been invaluable in helping us understand these complex dynamics. Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into today's talk. If you found this discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Inside Policy Talks. Stay connected with us for more in-depth conversations on the issues that matter to Canadians.